Just as she considered his offer, a drunkard in a dusty saloon coat staggered forward, leering. "I'll take her if nobody else wants her," he shouted, his hand reaching for Velma's arm. The iron horse shrieked as it pulled into the small town of Redford, steam hissing into the desert air. Velma sat stiffly on the bench seat, her hands clutched tightly around a battered carpet bag. Her heart raced, half in dread and half in hope. She had traveled hundreds of miles across dust, prairie, and endless plains to meet the man who promised her a new life. A mail-order bride, alone in a world where women's choices were limited, Velma clung to the idea of belonging somewhere, anywhere. When she stepped off the train, the sun burned her skin, and the dry wind whipped at her bonnet. Men lounged near the station, some tipping hats, others eyeing her with curiosity. But the face she sought was nowhere to be found. The sheriff, a wiry man with sad eyes, approached. "Ma'am," he said softly, removing his hat. "I reckon you're here for Thomas Kettle?" Velma nodded eagerly, hope shining in her eyes. The sheriff's jaw tightened. "I'm sorry to tell you. Thomas passed 3 weeks ago. Pneumonia took him fast." The carpet bag slipped from her hands, dust swirling around her boots, as Velma realized she had come all this way for nothing. Velma's knees weakened, but she forced herself to stand tall. The townsfolk whispered, some pitying, others amused. She wanted to run, but where could she go? With no money, no family nearby, and no fiancé, she was adrift in an unforgiving land. A man stepped from the edge of the crowd, Albert Harrow, Thomas's neighbor. Broad-shouldered, with calloused hands and eyes as weathered as the desert hills, he studied her with quiet sympathy. "Miss," he said, his voice steady, "Thomas spoke of you. I live on the next homestead over. If you've no place to go, I've got room. A roof, food, and honest work." Velma hesitated. To trust another stranger so soon felt like jumping into another storm. Yet something in his gaze, a mix of sorrow and decency, made her believe he wasn't a man of false promises. Just as she considered his offer, a drunkard in a dusty saloon coat staggered forward, leering. "I'll take her if nobody else wants her," he shouted, his hand reaching for Velma's arm. The sheriff barked a warning, but the drunkard only sneered, grabbing at Velma. Before anyone could move, Velma's hand snapped across his face with a crack that silenced the crowd. Her eyes blazed, tears brimming but unfallen. "I am not some parcel to be claimed," she spat, her voice trembling yet fierce. The drunkard stumbled back, clutching his cheek, his pride wounded more than his skin. Albert stepped between them, his presence steady as a rock. "That's enough," he growled, his voice low but commanding. The man muttered curses but slunk away under the sheriff's glare. The crowd dispersed, but not before whispers spread about the newcomer, who dared to stand her ground. Velma's heart still pounded, but for the first time since stepping off the train, she felt a flicker of strength returning. Albert lifted her bag with ease. "You've got spirit," he said, not as a jest but as recognition. Velma studied him, unsure whether to trust this rugged neighbor who seemed too kind for a land this cruel. Still, with the setting sun painting the sky in blood and gold, she nodded. "All right," she whispered. "I'll come." Neither of them noticed the outlaw watching from the shadows of the saloon porch, his grin sharp as a knife. The ride out to Albert's homestead was long and silent. Velma clutched her bag tightly as the wagon creaked over rocky ground. The land stretched out in every direction, endless fields of sagebrush, mesas rising in the distance, and a sky so vast it felt like it could swallow her whole. When they finally arrived, Albert's cabin appeared humble but solid, its wooden beams weathered by countless storms. Chickens scattered as they pulled up, and a single lantern glowed in the window, casting a soft warmth. Inside, the home bore the touch of a man who lived alone too long. Rough-hewn furniture, boots by the door, a rifle above the hearth. Yet Velma noticed small details, a Bible worn from use, a quilt folded neatly, and a rocking chair that spoke of longing for family. Albert cleared his throat. "It ain't much," he said, "but it's safe." Velma's heart tugged as she realized this was the first kindness she had been shown since stepping off the train. She managed a soft smile. "It's more than I hoped for." Just as she set her bag down, a wolf's distant howl broke the silence, and Albert's expression darkened with unspoken worry. That night, Velma lay awake on a small cot Albert prepared for her, the sound of crickets chirping through the cracks in the wood. She stared at the rafters, her mind swirling with questions. Who was this man who had taken her in so readily? Why did his eyes seem so haunted? In the darkness, she heard him pacing softly by the window, as though keeping guard against something unseen. At dawn, she found Albert outside, chopping wood with powerful, rhythmic strokes. When she offered to help, he hesitated before handing her a basket for kindling. As the sun climbed, Velma finally dared to ask, "Were you ever married?" His axe paused mid-swing. "A long time ago," he said gruffly. "Fever took her, and our little boy." His voice cracked slightly, then hardened. "Haven't spoken of it in years." Velma's chest ached. She knew then that his kindness came from a well of sorrow as deep as her own. As they stood in silence, a rider thundered past the fence line, kicking up dust and leaving Albert with a grim look. "That's bad news," he muttered. Later that day, the same rider appeared in town. Folks whispered his name like a curse, Clayton Briggs, leader of a ruthless gang that prowled the county. Briggs swaggered into the saloon, his spurs jangling, his grin wicked. "I hear there's a new lady in town," he drawled. "A pretty little bird all alone." The sheriff stiffened but said nothing, knowing Briggs had too many guns backing him. Word traveled fast in Redford, and by sundown Albert already knew. When he returned home, he found Velma sweeping the porch, her face flushed from the sun. "We've got trouble," he warned. "Briggs doesn't leave folk alone once he sets his eyes on them." Velma gripped the broom handle, her knuckles white. She had crossed miles of wilderness to escape uncertainty, only to find danger waiting in a new form. But Albert's steady gaze gave her courage. "Then we stand together," she whispered. From the ridge beyond the pasture, a shadowy figure watched them through binoculars, the glint of sunlight catching the steel of a rifle barrel. 2 nights later, the town held a small gathering in the saloon, a chance for weary settlers to share music and laughter. Velma, urged by Albert, agreed to go. The saloon smelled of whiskey and pine, lanterns casting golden light across the room. A fiddler struck up a lively tune, and boots stomped in rhythm. For the first time since arriving, Velma allowed herself to laugh. Albert surprised her by extending his hand. "May I?" She hesitated, but his sincerity melted her resistance. They stepped onto the floor, moving awkwardly at first, then finding a rhythm together. His touch was steady, his presence protective. For a fleeting moment, Velma forgot about loss, danger, and fear. She felt alive. But as the music swelled, the saloon doors slammed open. Clayton Briggs himself stood there, eyes locked on her, his smirk cutting through the joy like a knife. The music died as Briggs tipped his hat to Velma and growled, "Next dance is mine, darlinda." The saloon held its breath. Albert stepped in front of Velma, his jaw tight. "She's not yours, Briggs," he said, his voice steady but cold. Briggs chuckled darkly. "You think you can keep her from me? A widow with ghosts and a mail-order bride nobody wanted." His words dripped venom, aimed at both of them. Velma's heart thundered. Every eye in the saloon was on them. Albert didn't flinch. "You'll leave her be." Briggs leaned closer, his grin dangerous. "Then prove it. Tomorrow dawn. Outside town. You and me." The crowd gasped. Everyone knew Briggs fought dirty, and Albert's quiet life as a rancher hadn't prepared him for such a showdown. Velma clutched Albert's sleeve, torn between fear and pride. If he refused, Briggs would hound them forever. If he accepted, she might lose the only man who had given her safety. Albert's eyes burned with determination as he spoke the words that sealed their fate. "I'll be there." Rain poured as the line of riders thundered toward town, their silhouettes jagged against flashes of lightning. Velma stood at the window, clutching the curtain as Albert loaded his rifle. "They're here sooner than I thought," he muttered, his voice low but steady. Velma's heart raced, yet she felt a strange calm beneath the fear. Albert had faced worse storms than this. By morning, Redford was crawling with outlaws. They loitered outside the saloon, their laughter coarse, their hands never far from their guns. Clayton Briggs, scarred now from his duel, wore the wound like a badge. He raised his glass high. "Redford belongs to me now," he declared. Townsfolk bowed their heads, too scared to meet his eyes. But Albert stood in the doorway, rifle across his chest. Velma watched from the boardwalk, her breath caught in her throat. Briggs sneered, then drew his revolver, not at Albert, but at the sheriff, who stood frozen at his side. The sheriff crumpled, blood pooling across the saloon floor, and the town gasped in horror. Briggs holstered his revolver like it was nothing. Any other lawmen want to make a stand? Silence. Redford was his. For 3 days, his men bled the town dry, taking cattle, whiskey, supplies, and leaving fear in their wake. Velma kept close to Albert as they helped neighbors where they could. She saw in him a quiet fire building, a determination not to let Briggs consume the place he called home. At night, they whispered plans by the lantern light. Velma's voice trembled but held firm. If we wait, they'll strip us bare. We have to act. Albert looked at her, pride flickering in his eyes. You're braver than most men I've known. As they whispered, a shadow appeared at the window, listening. Albert spun and threw the door open, rifle raised. Standing there was a ranch hand he'd known for years, Eli, his neighbor's boy. But Eli's eyes darted nervously, his hands raised. I didn't mean no harm, he stammered. Briggs told me to listen in, said he'd kill my ma if I didn't. Albert's finger tightened on the trigger, but Velma's hand on his arm stilled him. He's just a boy, she whispered. Albert lowered the rifle. Eli's shame was heavy as he confessed everything. Briggs was planning to burn Redford to the ground within the week. He says if he can't own it, no one will. Velma felt the room spin. There was no time to waste. Albert gripped Eli's shoulder firmly. Then you'll help us stop him. Do right by this town. Eli nodded, though fear still clung to him. Before they could plan further, a gunshot shattered the night. One of Briggs' men lay dead in the dirt outside Albert's cabin. Albert rushed outside, rifle ready, Velma just behind him. The body in the dirt was a warning. A bullet through the chest and a crude note pinned to the man's vest. Next time, it's you. Velma's breath hitched, her eyes darting to the dark horizon. Albert's jaw tightened. He's trying to scare us into running. The next day, Briggs' men tightened their grip on Redford. Neighbors whispered about leaving, abandoning the town to ruin. But Albert gathered the bravest among them in his barn. Ranchers, shopkeepers, even the blacksmith's wife with her shotgun in hand. Velma stood at his side, her chin high, her voice steady as she said, "This is our home. If we let him take it, we'll never find peace again." The room fell silent before the blacksmith finally spoke. "Then we fight." As they prepared, a horn's call echoed across the prairie. Briggs' men were assembling for war. The townsfolk worked through the night, barricading windows, stockpiling ammunition, and laying traps on the outskirts. Velma, skirts tied back, passed out cartridges with steady hands. She'd never held a gun before, but when Albert pressed one into her palm, she didn't flinch. "Stay close to me," he said. She met his gaze and answered, "No. I'll stand where I'm needed." Dawn broke to the sound of hooves. A thunderous wave as Briggs' men descended like wolves. Gunfire cracked, wood splintered, glass shattered. Redford's people fought with a desperation born of survival. Velma crouched behind a barrel, firing wild but determined. Albert moved like a man possessed, his rifle steady, his aim deadly. The air filled with smoke, screams, and the acrid stench of gunpowder. For a moment, it seemed the town might hold. Then, above the chaos, Briggs' voice roared, "Burn it all!" as his men lit torches and hurled them into the heart of Redford. Flames licked at rooftops as townsfolk scrambled to douse them, buckets of water passing from trembling hands. Children screamed while their mothers herded them toward safety. Smoke turned the dawn sky black. Albert barked orders like a commander, his voice carrying above the chaos. "Hold the line. Don't let them breach Main Street." Velma's heart pounded as she darted into the smoke, dragging 2 children away from a collapsing porch. Sparks caught at her skirts, but she batted them away with fierce determination. Albert caught sight of her and froze. Her courage left him both proud and terrified. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was fighting for the town as fiercely as anyone. "Velma," he shouted. But before he could reach her, a torch-wielding outlaw stepped from the smoke, blocking her path. The man raised his pistol at Velma's chest, the firelight dancing in his cold eyes. Time slowed. Velma's trembling hands clutched the revolver Albert had given her days before. The outlaw sneered, thinking she wouldn't dare. But Velma heard Albert's voice in her head, steady, reassuring. She squeezed the trigger. The blast nearly knocked her back, ears ringing. The outlaw staggered, dropped his torch, and crumpled to the dirt. Breathless, Velma stared at the gun in her hand. Smoke curled from the barrel, as if the weapon itself was alive. She had killed a man to save herself, and the realization shook her to her core. Albert reached her moments later, gripping her shoulders. "You did what you had to." Velma's eyes filled with tears, but there was no time for doubt. Gunfire raged around. Them louder, closer. The fight for Redford had only just begun. From the church bell tower, a sniper's rifle cracked. Albert staggered, clutching his side. Albert dropped to one knee, blood seeping through his shirt. Velma's scream cut through the thunder of battle. She dragged him behind a water trough as bullets sparked against the wood. "Stay with me," she begged, pressing her scarf to his wound. Albert's face was pale, but his eyes burned with determination. "Don't you cry, Velma. This town needs you steady." Through the smoke, he spotted the sniper resetting his aim. Gritting his teeth, Albert raised his rifle with trembling hands and fired. The shot rang true. The sniper toppled from the tower, landing with a sickening thud. Velma exhaled in relief, but Albert slumped heavily against her, weaker by the second. The town roared with violence all around them, yet in that moment, it felt like the world had narrowed to just the two of them. Velma looked up and saw Clayton Briggs himself riding into the square, guns blazing, shouting her name. Clayton Briggs cut through the smoke like a demon, his scarred face twisted with rage. "Velma," he bellowed. "You should have been mine." His men cheered as they surged behind him. Albert tried to rise, but the pain forced him back down. Velma, shaking yet unbroken, stood between Albert and Briggs, revolver in hand. The outlaw king laughed, dismounting with predatory ease. "A mail-order bride turned gunfighter? This'll be a story worth telling." He circled her, daring her to falter. Velma's knees trembled, but she kept her stance. Albert's voice rasped behind her. "Don't let him see your fear." The crowd of townsfolk cowered, waiting for someone to break the deadlock. Velma's hand twitched toward her revolver as Briggs smirked, ready to strike. Suddenly, the church bell rang, not from fire, but from townsfolk rallying. Reinforcements poured into the square. The sound of the church bell galvanized Redford. Farmers, shopkeepers, even teenagers with slingshots surged into the square, rallying around Albert and Velma. The outlaws, caught off guard, faltered. Bullets flew, and Briggs' men began to scatter under the unexpected resistance. The air filled with shouts and smoke as the town fought back with newfound fury. Velma moved with the crowd, firing carefully, covering Albert as he reloaded despite his wound. Together, they became the heart of the fight, man and woman, standing side by side. Briggs cursed, firing wildly, his control slipping. For the first time, his grin faded. Velma met his gaze across the chaos and felt a spark of something she had never known before. Strength, belonging, love forged in fire. Just as the outlaws began to retreat, Briggs leveled his revolver. Not at Albert, but at Velma. He pulled the trigger. The shot rang out like a thunderclap. Velma staggered, the revolver slipping from her hand as the crowd gasped. Albert roared, surging to his feet despite his wound, catching her before she fell. Blood stained her sleeve. It was only a graze, but fear knifed through him all the same. Briggs howled with laughter. "Not so pretty now, are you?" Albert's fury boiled over. He raised his rifle and fired, forcing Briggs to dive behind a horse trough. The square erupted again in chaos, but this time the townsfolk roared with vengeance. Velma, gritting her teeth, forced herself upright. "I'm not done," she whispered, retrieving her gun. Albert met her eyes and nodded. Side by side, they stepped back into the fight. Briggs whistled sharply. 3 fresh riders appeared at the edge of town, rifles gleaming in the morning sun. The new riders barreled into Redford, scattering townsfolk with a storm of bullets. Buildings splintered, windows shattered, and panic spread. Albert fired with precision, dropping one rider from the saddle. Velma, heart hammering, focused on another. Her shot struck true, sending the man tumbling. The last rider charged straight for her, revolver aimed at her heart. Time seemed to freeze. Velma squeezed the trigger, but her gun clicked empty. The rider's grin widened, until Eli, the young ranch hand, appeared from behind a wagon and shot him clean off his horse. Velma gasped, tears welling. "You saved me," she whispered. Eli only nodded, his jaw tight. The boy had become a man in that instant. Across the square, Briggs dragged a terrified townswoman by the hair, pressing his gun to her head. "Drop your weapons, or she dies." The fight stilled in an instant. Mothers clutched children, men froze mid-step. Briggs' eyes gleamed with madness as he held the woman tight. "You thought you could defy me," he snarled. "Redford belongs to me, or it burns to ashes with you in it." Albert aimed his rifle, but Briggs yanked his human shield closer. "You'll hit her first." Velma stepped forward, her voice steady despite her trembling. "Let her go, Briggs. This isn't strength, it's cowardice." The outlaw's face twisted. "You think you're strong, mail-order bride? You're nothing." Velma raised her chin. "I'm more than you'll ever be." Her words cut sharper than any bullet, and the crowd murmured, emboldened. Briggs faltered for the first time, rage replacing confidence. In that heartbeat of hesitation, Albert pulled the trigger, only for Briggs to vanish in the smoke, dragging his hostage into the alley. Gunfire faded as Albert and Velma tore after Briggs through the narrow alleys of Redford. The town smoldered around them, ash and smoke choking the air. Every shadow seemed to hold danger. Velma clutched her half-empty revolver, scanning for movement. "He's wounded," Albert muttered, blood dripping from his own side. "He won't get far." They found the hostage, shaken but alive, tied behind the livery. Briggs' blood marked the dirt like breadcrumbs. Albert raised his rifle, eyes blazing with vengeance. "This ends tonight." Velma grabbed his arm. "Not just for you, for all of us." Together, they followed the trail into the desert, the sun sinking low, painting the sky in fire. At the base of a jagged canyon, Briggs waited, guns drawn, his men forming a deadly circle around him. The canyon walls loomed like tombstones as Briggs' gang closed in, revolvers gleaming. Albert lifted his rifle despite his wound, while Velma stood firm beside him, revolver steady in her hand. The standoff stretched, every breath heavy with death. Briggs smirked. "One last dance, Albert. You and your precious bride-to-be against the devil and his hounds." The first shot cracked and chaos exploded. Bullets sparked against stone, horses screamed, and echoes thundered through the canyon. Albert fought like a man with nothing to lose, dropping outlaw after outlaw with deadly aim. Velma fired beside him, each shot driven by fury and love. Briggs moved like a shadow, slipping between rocks, his laughter chilling. "You can't kill me," he taunted. But Albert's jaw clenched. "I already did back in Redford." As the dust cleared, Briggs lunged from the shadows, his revolver aimed square at Albert's heart. The canyon echoed with death's music, gunfire, horses' cries, and the groans of the dying. Dust swirled like a storm, choking Albert as he squared himself against Clayton Briggs. The outlaw's revolver glinted in the fading light, aimed straight at his chest. Albert's rifle was empty. He had no time, no cover. Only fate stood between him and the grave. Briggs' grin stretched wide, his finger tightening on the trigger. But before the shot rang, Velma stepped between them. Her revolver fired, once, twice, 3 times. The blasts tore through the canyon, smoke filling the air. Briggs staggered backward, shock etched across his scarred face. He fell to his knees, blood staining his shirt, his revolver clattering to the ground. "A mail-order bride," he spat, his voice fading into a rasp. "Killed me." His body slumped lifeless against the rocks. The canyon went silent. Albert dropped his rifle, stumbling to Velma, pulling her close with shaking hands. "You saved me," he whispered. She pressed her forehead to his. "No, Albert. We saved each other." Around them, the last of Briggs' men scattered into the desert, their will broken. Redford's nightmare had ended. As Albert collapsed from blood loss, Velma screamed his name, her hands slick with his blood. "Don't you leave me, Albert." "Not now." Albert's world swam in and out of darkness as Velma and Eli dragged him back into Redford. The townsfolk rushed forward, doctors and mothers, men and children who had once bowed under Briggs' cruelty. They worked together, tending wounds, calming horses, mending what had been broken. For the first time in years, Redford breathed free. Days later, Albert awoke in his own bed, sunlight warming his face. Velma sat at his side, her hand clasping his. Tears of relief spilled down her cheeks. "You came back to me," she whispered. He reached weakly for her cheek, his smile faint but true. "I promised I wouldn't leave you, Velma. Not now. Not ever." Outside the window, laughter echoed as the townsfolk rebuilt, not with fear, but with hope. Weeks passed. The scars of battle remained, but Redford thrived. And on a quiet morning, beneath the wide western sky, Albert and Velma stood hand in hand as the town gathered. Not as strangers, not as survivors, but as family. Their vows were spoken not just to each other, but to Redford itself.